what we're trying to do with Jews for Secular Democracy is create a unique space for Jews to come at particular issues from both a Jewish perspective and I think also a secular perspective, to advocate for a stronger separation of church and state. Church and state separation is not a statement or issue, I think, that makes people feel emotionally heated upon hearing it. We created this catchphrase, religion out of government, which I think has a little bit more strength. But it's still one step removed from the emotional issues. But if I say abortion, that is an emotional issue. And what we're saying with Jews for Secular Democracy is that reproductive rights is a church-state separation issue. And LGBTQ equality, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer equality, is a separation of church and state issue. And the way I know that is because it is one religion and really one stream of one religion's perspective on women's reproductive rights, on LGBTQ equality, that is dominating our government's approach to laws on those issues. And if we can help the Jewish community understand that yes, there's issues of inclusion and fairness and all kinds of things that we can talk about, but there's a bottom line, which is if the government was neutral to all religions and to no religion, then they would have to take into account our perspective on these issues as Jews and as secular people. What is the Jewish perspective on when life begins? I promise you it's not life begins at conception. That is not a Jewish concept. The mother's health always took priority over the fetus in Jewish history. And so there are things that and frankly, it was not considered a fetus for I forget the terminology, but there was a time frame that they understood. And that's in our religious heritage. But we can also come at it from just a secular perspective and say, no, this should be determined by what science says. And so those are two perspectives that are not being taken into account when we talk about women's reproductive rights. And there's a great organization, so LGBTQ equality as well, called Keshet. Have you heard of Keshet? I don't know if you've ever had someone come in and speak, but they are an organization advocating for LGBTQ equality and inclusion within the Jewish community. And they do great work, and I'm an admirer and supporter of them. But a week or two ago, so I follow them on Facebook, and there was a decision, one of like a weekly occurrence, where there was another decision against LGBTQ equality. And they posted that article, and they wrote above it that we know this to be untrue. We know that LGBTQ people are equal because the Bible says we were all created in God's image, and therefore, blah blah blah. We're against this position. And I call myself an atheist when it comes to the God of the Bible. That doesn't work for me, that doesn't resonate for me, because I feel like if you're trying to fight religion with religion alone, then you're giving them legitimacy on the grounds that they're basing their, frankly, discrimination and hate against, because the same source is pretty clear on homosexuality. In Leviticus, there's the line that, it's an abomination. And what we can say as secular people is, that's what our Bronze Age ancestors believed, and they were wrong. And we know better now. And we can just say, we've moved, we've progressed. And for the folks who are tied into the notion that this text is divine and therefore infallible, and we have to look for other lines that can justify what we're saying, to counteract the lines in the same text that support what they're saying. That's not a battle I ever want to be in. So we can come at this from a completely different battle, from a different angle. And Jews overwhelmingly in the US support gay marriage and LGBTQ equality. And we do so not because of one line or the other in the Torah. We do it because most Jews are secular, most Jews accept science, and most Jews want to be open and inclusive of all people, and because we have experienced the minority experience in America. We have been persecuted against. We know what that's like, and we don't want it for anybody else anymore, including still ourselves. So we see Jews for a Secular Democracy as having this unique niche in the world, because from the Jewish community, nobody is coming at this from a church-state separation perspective. And there are other issues that we can also talk about in terms of the government not being neutral on a lot of different issues because of the influence of Christian fundamentalism today. But besides having that unique perspective in the Jewish community, we also have a unique perspective in the secular world. Now, one of the nice things about working at Society for Humanistic Judaism is I've become aware of the work of organizations like Secular Coalition for America, which we are a founding member organization of. They're an umbrella group for a whole bunch of organizations like American Humanist Association, American Atheists. Center for Inquiry is a really large organization that I had never heard of before I started this work, and now I know what they do, and they do amazing work. These are all secular organizations working on church-state separation issues. And this is the avenue that unites all of those organizations, is how do we keep government out of religion? We have our foot in that world as well, but none of them can come at it from a Jewish perspective. So I just learned yesterday, we're doing this conference in April, which I hope some or all of you will come to, but it's out in Michigan, so I'm sorry for that, but that's where the mothership is, the Birmingham Temple. And it's SHJ's 50th anniversary, so my organization is 50 years old. My organization is slightly older than I am, by a couple of months. And actually, no, I'm older than the organization. That's depressing, by a couple of months. We are having, as our guest speaker, a woman named Rachel Lasser, who became president and CEO of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, come and speak, which I'm really excited about because she's amazing, and she's Jewish, and she just began a little over a year ago, but she'll be able to speak from from her own personal Jewish perspective about her work at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, which I admit, again, is an organization I really hadn't known anything about until I started working at SHJ. And I'm really glad I know them and I support them, but they can't come at it from this perspective of, hey, as a Jew, I know what it's like, or my parents or my grandparents. We don't have to go back any further than our grandparents. Knows what it's like to experience state-sponsored, really, discrimination. We were discriminated against by law, and it was allowed. You know, the colleges, the Ivy Leagues were allowed to have quota systems to how many Jews they would let in until it was overturned by law. They were, country clubs and hotels were allowed to say, no, we don't take Jews here. It happened in this country and in some of our lifetimes or our parents or grandparents. So we know what that's like, and now that we see it happening, particularly for the LGBTQ community, but we also know we're not far behind on that list. And one example is happening right now. Literally this week, the Trump administration made an exception. I don't know if you've heard about this. In I think it's South Carolina, there is an adoption agency. It is a Christian adoption agency that gets federal funds. They will only adopt out to Christians that they of their denomination. So I don't think they're Catholic, and I don't think they would even adopt out to Catholic, let alone to Jews or to LGBTQ. So the headlines have been that this adoption agency is discriminating against LGBTQ and Jews and is federally funded, and just got this exception from the Trump administration to do that. And so, we've been saying for a year now that we're on this list, you know, so LGBTQ is getting it the hardest right now, but we're on that list. And even if we weren't, I think we'd all still want to advocate for total equality for all Americans. So that's a piece of what we've been touching on with Jews for a Secular Democracy. Where we'd like to go with it is to find somebody to give us $1 million and then bring someone on who will organize two different target populations that I'm thinking about right now. One is a population of thought leaders, so people who are constitutional lawyers, who are working on this as their full-time profession, who are experts in this, professors, and who also come with deep Judaic knowledge. Because what I want us to do is be able to say, from the Jewish perspective, from the Jewish historic perspective, here's where this has happened to us before, here's why all Jews should stand together to oppose this. I think that would come from folks who are very savvy on this, and I'd love to organize them. And then the other group I'd like to organize is people in our communities to take action, to be able to utilize what these thought leaders propose or write about, and then on the local level, take it to your congressperson. You know, have anybody here actually sat and spoken with or met with your congressperson? I didn't either, but again, through my work with Secular Coalition for America as a member organization, they put me in front of, not my congressperson, they put me in front of the staffers of my congressperson, but separation of church and state is not that big of an issue in Brooklyn. But they put me in front of a guy named Steve Cohen, who is the representative, longtime representative of Memphis, Tennessee. And he's Jewish, and he had, first of all, never heard of secular humanistic Judaism, so goal number one was to let him know that we exist, which was exciting, but to also talk to him about separation of church and state issues. And it was a challenging, interesting 20-minute conversation where I feel like I got one point across. So first of all, he basically came all but outed himself as non-theistic in some ways. He's involved with a reform community down there. He wasn't he wasn't committal, and he told me that I didn't convert him, right? So that's okay. But he understood our perspective. And what was interesting was when I said to him, one of the things that we want to say with Jews for a Secular Democracy is for people to stop using the phrase Judeo-Christian tradition, because you never hear that from the Jewish community, because we know that that tradition doesn't have nearly as much overlap as the folks who say that think it does. And his initial reaction was, well, I think that that is an inclusive term. And I think that a lot of people, including in the Jewish community, do think that when they say Judeo-Christian tradition, they're including us, and that's good. But I think that there's something more sinister, frankly, going on when that phrase is being used, Judeo-Christian. And I pointed out again on the LGBTQ point, when they say Judeo-Christian, they're talking about the line from the Judeo part of the Bible, right? Because it's not, I don't believe homosexuality is mentioned at all in the New Testament. They're talking about very selectively the lines from the 5 books of Moses against homosexuality, which of course they cherry pick because they're still eating shellfish and wearing cotton poly blends. All of those are abominations also, right? That you should be stoned to death for. But when they say Judeo-Christian, they want to pull bits and pieces from us, and the reality is that's never been our tradition. It's never been enforced where, or it hasn't been in 3,000 years where someone has been stoned to death for being homosexual in the Jewish community. And where is that being represented when those folks who are using that phrase, Judeo-Christian, use that phrase? The Jewish community has taken a different approach to our source text. It's our source text, and yet if you don't also look at the Talmud and the thousands of years of conversation after it, that's not how we use our own source text. So let's abolish Judeo-Christian. And so he got it, and it was a powerful moment because he didn't say it so much as slight nod. But a week or two afterwards, I was told by Secular Coalition for America that Representative Cohen agreed to caucus with the Free Thought Caucus in Congress. So caucuses in Congress are interest groups, basically, that Congress people align themselves with. And so there's like a big oil caucus or something, but there's also like a educational caucus. Like there's, I think, hundreds of them. And last year, a Free Thought Caucus was started in Congress, first time ever, to at least acknowledge and listen to free thinkers, atheists, agnostics, secular people, which is a growing percentage in America. And they said that they thought my conversation with him was helpful. And that felt amazing to me because it was like a new professional thing I'd never done before after having worked for a long time. And what I also realized is this is something that everybody can do in this room, everywhere. Your congressperson particularly, maybe not your senator, your senator may put you in front of a staff person. Your congressperson will give you the time, particularly if you go down, if you're in DC, and set up an appointment. And if you want to do it, Secular Coalition for America will help you set up that appointment. And they will listen to you, and you will be a voice of whatever you want to represent, whether it's a secular perspective on separation of church and state, whether it is humanistic Judaism, which they, some of them have heard of, but many have not. Whatever, whether it's, getting the trash cleared off your main street, like they have to kind of give you the time of day in some way, because in most cases they want to know their constituencies, and they understand that there's a limited number of people, and they want to make you happy. So it's a great opportunity, and that organizing people to be able to go do that and to have what to say about it is the other side of what we want to do with Jews for a Secular Democracy. So I'll stop there, get your reaction, and we can go from there. What do you think, Rob?
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, who are the people who produce the content for the website, for the Facebook page?
We can all do that, and you're welcome to. So send me stuff. It is a combination of myself, and our board president, Richard Logan, is very involved, and a couple of other folks on SHJ's board on a volunteer level. There is the Facebook page. There's also a website that we set up that has a blog. So Facebook is good if you only have 3 sentences to say about some outrage that's happening, and then you post the article about the outrage. The blog is good if you actually want to go deeper and write a page about either what you've experienced personally, or you want to dig deeper on it, or you have some knowledge that you want to share, or so on. So we do have somebody from City Congregation in Manhattan who has contributed a couple of blog entries because reproductive rights is something that he's dug deep in. So he's written a couple of blogs, and then we post the blog to Facebook to bring people from one to the other. But those are the 2 current mechanisms that we have. And if you want to write something, or if you have something that you think we should put up there, just email me, or in fact, just go to that page and post it, and I'll see it, and we'll share it.
My other question was, and you may have already sort of given the answer to it, but are there organizations, Jewish organizations unaffiliated with SHJ, who participate in this in some fashion?
Right. Not yet,
Okay.
but we just launched, and I think the next step is for us to get a grant, which is something I'm working on, and it's why I have that clarity about what I want to do in terms of an organizer who's going to organize thought leaders and also grassroots leaders. That was from a grant proposal I put out there, and hopefully we'll get that, or we'll find somebody, some other foundation who wants to fund that. Once we have that, though, there's a great, I don't know if they're their own organization, but there's this thing called the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, and it brings together maybe 30 Jewish social justice organizations, and there are some great Jewish social justice organizations like Jews for Justice and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and Bend the Arc. Have you heard of Bend the Arc? They're a really big Jewish social justice organization, and they're all great, and they all come at it from a pluralistic perspective. But that pluralistic perspective prevents them in some ways from saying, this is a separation of church and state issue and we want the government completely out of religion. Because there are Jewish organizations in the Orthodox world, certainly, that want federal funding for their yeshivas. In fact, something that we just did a couple of weeks ago was SHJ now, but we got a mention of Jews for a Secular Democracy in this. SHJ wrote a letter on behalf of that whole secular movement I was mentioning, Secular Coalition for America. American Atheists signed it, American Humanist Association, all these large secular organizations signed on to this letter about, to the New York legislature about the exceptions that they've made for ultra-Orthodox yeshivot in New York to not enforce educational standards of English, math, etc. There are ultra-Orthodox yeshivas in parts of New York, greater New York, that are stopping secular education when the boys turn 13. The girls get to go a little further because they're not expected to be Talmud scholars. But at 13, the boys are exclusively learning Torah and Talmud in Yiddish and Hebrew. So there have been people who've come out of that community basically saying, I barely spoke English, or I didn't know how to function in a secular world. It kept me trapped in this ultra-Orthodox world because I didn't have that education. And they sued, and the case was very recently dismissed, but it's now in the court of the New York legislature to enforce. And we felt like, as one of the two Jewish organizations in the Secular Coalition for America, that it would be better for us to spearhead that letter because we can take this on without any concern, I think, of being anti-Semitic or being overly focused on the Jews or whatever it was. And we got a nice article about that also mentioned Jews for a Secular Democracy. That's the kind of issue that I think we have a unique angle on that I think many of the other Jewish social justice organizations won't necessarily take on. But all of them, none of them take a separation of church and state perspective as their main primary purpose, and I think that provides us with a great avenue on a lot of issues. Not all issues. I would love to address racism in certain ways that we will still do through Society for Humanistic Judaism, but I just don't know that it aligns directly with separation of church and state. So it also allows us to focus a bit, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah?
I ask a lot of people this question and I get different answers from everyone. What is your definition of secular?
Sure. Secular means, to me, without religion. And then it carries additional weight in terms of what it does include, right? So that's a without. It means with science and reason and empathy and logic and, you know, an understanding of the modern world. It means not relying on dogma to make decisions. And that is different than a religious understanding of the world. And it means not expecting that there will be supernatural intervention, which is a real expectation by a lot of our neighbors here in America, including, again, this week, I guess I'm purposely blanking out her name, the press secretary at the White House. Yeah, oh my God. Yes. This week took on Alexandria Cortez, and said that basically climate change is something that we're going to leave for a higher power. Like, she literally said that. And what does that mean? You know, her base understands exactly what that is in reference to, which is this earth is here at our disposal. Literally, we can dispose of it because when that big apocalypse happens, you know, we're all going to float up to heaven, the good ones. The rest of us will be left behind. And, you know, so what? So let's drill, baby, drill, right? And this idea of, and so, you know, even climate change is a church-state separation issue, because you've got fundamentalist Christians at the highest level of power now pulling this. I don't think Trump is a fundamentalist Christian, but that's who he's aligned with and beholden to. And so they believe that this world was created for our use. And I really have to get her name right. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I've seen it so much, but I haven't said it out loud, so I just have to keep saying it out loud till it just rolls off the tongue, because frankly, I don't want to get political or endorse anybody, but I really like her boldness, and she actually responded to that by saying, first of all, she said you shouldn't need the Bible to tell you to take care of the earth. But she also said, basically, how can you read the Bible and think that we're not supposed to take care of the earth? So it was, from both directions, it's just an insane theology to think, based on zero scientific evidence, that there is some kind of supernatural intervention in the world, that we can just do what we want because it's going to be taken care of. Mm-hmm.
So I'm still a little confused. First you said it means without religion for you, and then you said but we think about science and everything that how the world is now. So maybe I should be asking you, what is your definition of religion? Because I think we are, everybody in this room, I think we are secular, but we are not without religion.
Sure.
So,
right.
So how do you justify, it's without, but it's with?
Yeah.
So
without supernatural belief.
Okay.
And so we are a religion, we are a non-theistic religion, which I've had the joy of explaining to many, many people when I tell them about what I do. And they look perplexed, because if you're not religious, why are you part of a religion, and what does non-theistic religion mean, etc. So, yeah, and of course our movement is called secular humanistic Judaism. It's not just humanistic Judaism, it's secular humanistic Judaism. So secular is in our movement's name, but we are an organized religion. But I think that we're a very small percentage, and we're not the only secular or humanistic, or I should say non-theistic religion out there. There are many universal Unitarians believe themselves to be non-theistic, although I don't know whether the movement describes themselves that way, but they have a whole wing that does. And so does ethical culture, which was started in Manhattan over 100 years ago. So there are non-theistic religions. The Church of, what do they call it? It's not the Church of Satan, but there's a great, is it the Church of Satan? I should really remember it, but Lucian Greaves is the director of it, and they are brilliant because they are a registered religion. They clearly state they are a non-theistic religion, meaning they don't believe in the supernatural. But you wouldn't know it, because what they're doing is putting up huge statues of, they don't call him the devil. What do they call him? There's one of the names of the devil that I can't remember.
Satan?
No, well, Beelzebub. Yeah, Beelzebub. I think in state houses that also have the 10 Commandments, right? So they are basically the greatest trolls for separation of church and state, because every time that, or not every time, but they take on these communities where the state legislature decides we need to have religion represented in our Capitol building, so let's put up a 10 Commandments, which is pretty clearly, to me, a violation of church-state separation. So they say, okay, if you're going to do that, then we are entitled as a religion to also be represented, and here's our statue. And they roll out this truck of this goat-headed man with horns and two children like learning by his feet, and it's like, it's 12 feet tall, it's brilliant. And people get so outraged at them, and they think that these folks are really worshiping the devil, even though they're clearly stated as a non-theistic religion. But And they have won every case, for the most part, that they've done this with, either in court or they take down the Ten Commandments because they just can't stand having this other statue there. And so there are non-theistic religions, but I think it's such a sliver of what people out there think of when they hear the word religion. And the reality is, so today we're in a society where people are moving away from organized religion, but it doesn't mean that they're moving away from magical thinking. And I think all of us, I think it's human nature almost to have some kind of magical thinking, and if we were really honest with ourselves, we would be able to identify it in ourselves as well as even those of us like myself who feel like we're hardcore atheists. You know, like, do I want to sit in the same seat on the couch when my favorite team is playing because I might jinx them, you know, like, and then I'll catch it and I'm like, no, that's magical thinking or whatever. But sales of crystals are way up, right? Young people are not being involved in organized religion at all, but they're still like looking for that magical thing, or their horoscopes, or they're going to fortune tellers, or whatever it is. There's still a lot of magical thinking out there, and that, I think, is a part of what secular people are trying to counter, which is if it's giving you comfort, then okay, but when it starts to bleed into government policy that affects all of us, secular is where, and as it relates to government, to me, it also means neutral. So creating a neutral playing field where the government doesn't favor one viewpoint over the other. Yes, and then Charlie. Hmm?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about the Free Thinking Caucus that you mentioned. One is, how long has it been in existence? Is it just a Congress, or does it include the Senate? And how many people are in it?
Yep.
And what impact have they had, if any, on decisions or input to lawmaking?
I think only the House has caucuses, I believe, and it's only been around, I would say, at the most 8 months, or a year at the most. And it was founded by 2 congressmen. One is named Jamie Raskin in Baltimore, who's Jewish and is involved with a Reconstructionist synagogue and has once called himself a humanist, but then kind of backtracked on it. But he, again, you know, regardless of what politicians are able to say, and this is another issue, he wants to acknowledge and recognize and represent the viewpoints of secular and humanistic and agnostic people, together with a guy named Jared Hoffman from California. They were the co-founders, I believe, and now they're up to 10. So it's not huge, and I don't know how many times they've met. I certainly am aware of one meeting that they had recently, and I think that their mere existence has been a win for this movement in a really bad year. 2018 was a really bad year for secular and humanistic and agnostic people when it comes to our government. So this was like a shining light in an otherwise down year. So that's one thing. And as far as how many more congresspeople they may be able to pull on, I don't know. Yeah, but it's there, and that's really important. And these folks are willing to at least, if not come out themselves about what they believe, say that there's a whole group of Americans who believe a certain way. And now the Pew Foundation believes it's up to something like 23% of all Americans don't affiliate with any organized religion, which is way up from where it was 10 years ago. But as far as our House and Senate go, 0%. Or maybe one person in our whole federal government is willing to say, I don't have a religion. And that means we are underrepresented. And that's one of the challenges that we hope to address. Yeah, Charlie?
First, the Senate has caucuses, but they're informal.
Okay.
So they're not, in the House, they're all funded.
Got it.
So
thank you. Good to know.
So one of the concerns or problems I see is there's been a tension in the United States, and certainly from the founding of America, between religion and secularism. I mean, you can see it from Plymouth Rock to Jamestown.
Right.
One's more business-oriented, one is more religious-oriented. From the Constitution on up, even from the 1700s, there's these awakenings,
Right.
the First Great Awakening in the early 1700s, and then in the early 1800s, and then you have the Enlightenment folks,
Right.
Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. So you have this ebb and flow of, hey, we are a religious nation, to, no, we're not, we go the other way. But the problem is, we have always been, from day one, the country is founded on Enlightenment philosophies,
Right.
but based on Christian mores, not religion. Their mores, their culture, because they were all Protestants at the time.
Right.
And even when the Constitution was done, states had, Massachusetts had Congregationalists. And
Sure.
they were the state-funded religion, although they were not really state-funded.
Right.
So it's been there.
Yeah.
It's in the genetics of the country. So while, obviously I'm all for it in the separation, we're fighting a battle that from its founding,
Right.
in its core, has a tension built into it, but not a real type of separation. Matter of fact, there's been arguments about Madison used the wrong word, a wall. It should have been a line, because
Right.
the line then can be moved
Right.
up and back, more religious, less religious, rather than this wall that is immovable.
Well, we know walls can be circumvented too, right? Isn't
Yes,
that the
yes.
conversation
Build a
today?
wall, you build a-
But yeah,
you
but I hear what you're saying, and it's a really important point. But there's been an ebb and flow. This has been a back and forth. It is encoded. Our country is not a Christian country, but it does have a Christian majority, and it has always had a Christian majority. And it was in some ways in our founding DNA in some ways, but so was slavery in our founding DNA, right? And we overcame it. And the thing is, the way to overcome it was also encoded in that founding DNA with all men are created equal. Like, they had to have known when they were writing that there were slaves around them as they're writing those words, all men are created equal. And so they set up these ideals that were not being enacted then, that didn't get enacted in some ways for 100 years, and that in some ways have yet to be enacted. But that's what progress means to me, right? That's why I'm okay saying I'm a progressive, and that we're getting progressively more free. And certainly the Jewish community has experienced that. And I thought we were getting there for LGBTQ people as well. And we had an amazing success on that with the Supreme Court 2 years ago, making gay marriage legal in the land. And now we're experiencing a reactionary wave. And it's way stronger than I think many people felt it was going to be. And we're just going to go back and forth. But I'm trying to put our voice into that mix. And I think we have something unique to say. There's this other case that's coming up now in Maryland, Bladensburg, Maryland. Have you heard of this case where there's this massive cross? Can you see this cross? Does that look like a secular symbol to you? No. This is on federally funded land, and it's maintained by taxes. And it was put up, I think, after World War I to represent the fallen soldiers, not all of whom were Christian. And the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case, which is not good news, because the court below them said, no, this is a religious symbol. So that the Supreme Court is now going to hear this case next month. American Humanist Association is the plaintiff. Is not a good sign that they didn't just say, no, the lower court's decision was the correct one. So if they overturn that decision, they're basically saying that a gigantic cross is a symbol that all people just understand that we mean religion here, we don't mean a specific religion. I think a cross is as specific as it gets, though. And again, I think that American Humanist Association certainly is going to make powerful arguments about this doesn't represent the secular soldiers who were fallen, this doesn't represent the Jewish soldiers that were fallen. But I think when I show this picture to anybody in the Jewish community, they're just going to have this kind of visceral reaction of, that's what my tax money is going to support, so when you talk about that moving line of separation of church and state, okay, but let's identify it, you know, and let's talk about what we mean by secular versus religion. I mean, this to me is a religious symbol. There's a debate, I would say, about whether a Christmas tree is a religious symbol. Some people would argue it's a secular holiday thing, but the cross to me is pretty obvious. So that's another current thing that's happening. You know, you heard the case of the baker who would not bake for a gay wedding. And I just feel like, first of all, obviously, I disagree with that and that ruling, but I also just feel like, as a Jew, when is this coming around? You know, would he put a Jewish star on my cake? You know, would he write Mazel Tov? Like, I don't know, but now he doesn't have to because of that ruling, and lots of other folks don't as well. And do I think that we're going to start seeing commercial discrimination against the Jewish community anytime soon? No. But it's now, the door is open, and we've been there before, and we just don't want to go back to it.
How does Jews for a secular democracy pick and choose the issues it wants to fight? And for example, I'm thinking of one issue now, particularly from the health area, where there's this measles epidemic
Anti-vaxxers.
in the Jewish community, and I've been reading a lot about it, that some of the Jews who refuse to vaccinate their children say there's a religious basis. But if you read things about some rabbis' opinions, they said that really there's nothing that would prohibit Jews from vaccinating their children.
Right.
And it's a health issue that affects the greater community. So, and they're using a religious basis there to not vaccinate their children.
So, yeah, so
and would you take a position, I mean, the organization, about something like that?
Yeah, I think we would. I think the criteria we're looking at can we articulate how it's a separation of church-state issue? That's step one. And step two is, do we have a particular thing to say about that from a Jewish perspective, from a Jewish historic perspective or Jewish religious perspective? I mean, we're secular Jews, but we can still draw from our experience as a religious minority and our experience saying, hey, our religion actually says this about, you know, as I mentioned, abortion. You know, we can still use that as a source of information, and then along with lots of other sources. On this one, I would ask, you know, is there a role that government plays legally in terms of vaccination? And then if there is, you know, is there a position that there are religious exemptions to it? And then do we need to say that that's a bad law, that that's an unconstitutional law because it favors one religion over the general health? But that one I think is more challenging. There's this law that now a lot of fundamentalists are relying on, called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it happened in 1993 under, I believe, a totally democratic regime. It was under Bill Clinton. It was introduced by Chuck Schumer when he was a representative, and in the House by Ted Kennedy. So you think, okay, well, this is going to be a progressive bill. And at the time it was. And what they were trying to protect was the Native Americans' sacred grounds that were being given up to corporations and so on, and also the Native Americans' rights to use peyote in religious ceremony and not be arrested for it, which was happening. And this passed by an outrageously wide consensus on both sides of the aisle. But what's happened over the 20 years is it's been twisted to get us to this cake baker where the idea of protecting the individual's religious freedom became allowing individuals to discriminate because of their religious views. So this law about Religious Freedom Restoration Act is what is leading to things like this adoption agency in South Carolina being able to say, hey, if I'm forced to adopt out our kids to Jews, then you're violating my religious belief that Jews are sinners, right? And so the government now sides with that argument. And so we've gone completely in a different direction with this than what was originally intended. So that's part of the challenge about litigating these kind of things. You know, along with the anti-vaxxers, which I think I don't know how big a deal that is in the Jewish community, but I read what you're talking about. You know, there's this other thing that happens in New York around circumcision, where at brisses, this might gross some people out, so maybe that's cool. The moil, the guy who does the ritual circumcision, draws out the blood from the cut on the penis with his mouth. And it has led to the spread of herpes and the death of several infants. And you would think that the death of one infant would prompt this ritual to be made illegal. But that can't happen in New York City, where the ultra-Orthodox vote as a bloc, and even our liberal mayor needed them to become mayor. So the compromise was, we will simply ask that parents sign a permission form, right? A consent form beforehand. And they still block that. So we don't even have that as a law in New York City that says you need to get the parents' written consent before a moil puts his mouth on a 8-day-old baby's penis. Can't even get that. So, you know, I think that's, you know, that touches on this separation of church and state issue of, you know, well, so Native Americans should be allowed to use peyote in their rituals, so this is our ritual, and why would you outlaw it, right? Now we can all say that's barbaric. In Denmark and Iceland, they say all circumcision, period, is barbaric, and we're going to outlaw it. Well, where do we stand on that? As Jews, that's a ritual that, you know, if done hygienically, most Jews still support. There's significant debate, but I don't think there is agreement that it should be outlawed completely, as is kosher slaughter now in a number of European countries. Does that stem from anti-Semitism? You know, I don't know. They don't have the encoded line in their constitutions about religious freedom necessarily the way we do. So I don't know how they litigate it in the same ways, but I can see where in this country it could potentially lead to those kind of things as well. So we have to figure out, how do we take a stand on things like that, recognizing that it could turn into the disaster that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act turned into for people who are genuinely for religious freedom, because now it's a vehicle for discrimination. Yeah.
You know, you talked, I thought, interestingly about bringing the sort of a Jewish perspective of Jewish history to these questions of separation of church and state. And while you were talking, I was thinking there's a part of the name being secular that's also relevant.
Right.
Because as you start talking about these different questions, issues, we make distinctions about what are secular institutions or secular practices in this country. So we've decided that marriage is not a religious institution in this country officially,
right.
Even though it's carried out by religious figures. But it's, you go to City Hall,
right.
You don't, you know, and vaccination is part of a public health program, which is again a secular practice. And so I wonder if you have some thoughts about how the secular part of who we are,
right,
can also be brought to bear on these questions.
Right, and that's where I think, so for us, when we say secular democracy, we want to clarify that we're talking about our government's approach to the business that they do and the work and the laws that they pass, and not that we're saying we want America to be completely secular, because there should be room for people who believe to practice their religion and to have the freedom to do so. It's about what kind of playing field our government sets up for both the religious and the not religious and the religious minorities. So we have to be clear that when we say secular democracy, we're really talking about our government being secular. When we talk about coming at it as Jewish people and secular people, that's where I think we can say, you know, like with reproductive rights, okay, as Jewish people, we have this history of understanding abortion and reproductive rights. And here's what they said. Here's what the rabbi said in the Talmud, where they took a more nuanced view of when life begins, what happens with abortion, what the child's soul. I'm sure there's stuff about like, does the child have a soul? And we can say this was the Jewish tradition, and this is different than what our laws are being decided on, which is the Christian tradition, which is favoring that tradition over ours and others. But we can also say, let's also look at it from the scientific perspective. Let's also look at it from our understanding of when consciousness begins, or when, you know, I think there's a number of scientific perspectives on this, but I think that science in general, you know, it's called an embryo for a certain period because it's not a fetus yet, and there's a fetus, you know, like there are stages, and I don't know that how big a debate it is in the scientific community, and someone here may have a better handle on that than I do, but I think science has something different to say than Judaism. But I think we can incorporate both those to say, look, if you've got Christians' perspective, Jews' perspective, secular people's perspective, the government should be hands off, or should be going with science over religion, period, because it's not favoring any religion or all religions. So I think that there are different arguments that could be made, and the secular component can be brought in from on most of those.
Yeah, because when you were talking about this law that passed in '93, I was thinking about, well, for the Native Americans who are practicing their religion on land that was stolen from them, that is a religious question for them, as we would consider. They may not call it religious. But the cake bakers are doing business.
Right.
Business is a secular part
That's
of our
right.
world.
Right.
You know, if you file with the government to be a corporation or an LLC, that is part of the world of humanity,
Right.
not of supernatural.
That's right. And what really broke that open was the Hobby Lobby case in, I think, 2014, in which the government said that, yes, you as a private corporation, and a large one, frankly, don't have to cover contraception in the Affordable Care Act. Like, they took that out of it because Hobby Lobby won this case, because the folks who own Hobby Lobby are religious Christian fundamentalists who believe that contraceptive use is bad, and there's only one purpose for sex, and that's procreation. Welcome to the conversation. And right, as from a secular perspective, that is now, I think, a disaster, and it was seen as a disaster right off the bat by most, you know, by many people, maybe most people. And how much of this can we now expect? Because we have a Supreme Court that is now 5-4 in favor of these kind of rulings, and, you know, we don't pray in humanistic Judaism, but we might make an exception for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because we really need her there for as long as she can hold out. Yeah.
Maybe I'm a little bit of a dissenting opinion.
Okay.
But the Hobby Lobby conversation, or the baker conversation,
Right.
versus the adoption agency conversation, to me are different conversations,
Mhm.
right? Because one was about federal funding, and another is about an individual business, private business owner's right in the United States of America to be a jerk.
Right.
Right? And my right to not go to their business.
Right.
And I don't know to what extent I want to also impede on somebody else's right to be a jerk.
So
I think it's a slippery slope.
right, I hear what you're saying, and to me, the difference is that we need, and we have in this country, protected classes of people. We have protected classes of people. So there was a time, some of you were alive, when there were places that black people couldn't go shopping at, right? And then there were laws to change that because those people would still be doing it today because they're jerks. So they would have maintained that whites only forever if the laws didn't change. And so what's happening here is that I think it can be demonstrated pretty clearly, scientifically, that gay and lesbian people are discriminated against and should be a protected class in certain ways. But the reason they're being discriminated against is religion, not racism, and therefore our government is allowing it. And that's why I feel like this is a legitimate battle and that he doesn't have the right to discriminate. He's not just being a jerk to everybody. If he wants to be a jerk to everybody, then that's him. But he's being a jerk just to this specific kind of person, and that's discrimination. And he now has cover for his discrimination based in a religion that our government is supporting over other religions, because our religion says you shouldn't do that. In some ways, we can make that case for that anyway. And certainly our religion, secular humanistic Judaism, says you can't do that, that's wrong. So why is their religion taking precedent over our religion when our government is not supposed to favor one religion over another?
And how is cake baking different than housing? If you're in business,
right,
and we have fair housing laws,
yeah,
that you can't discriminate against these protected categories when you rent a house or sell a house to someone.
right, and I'm sure that's
like that many years ago, where the people who were racist
mm-hmm.
were using the non-protected categories and claiming it was their religious belief
mm-hmm.
for why they were allowed to discriminate. So they were saying, I don't have to rent this apartment to this woman, not because she's black, but because she's unmarried.
mm-hmm.
Because unmarried is not
right.
a protected category.
Right.
Or I don't have to rent this apartment to this person or sell this house to this person, not because he's black, it was a Marine actually, I remember, but because he's gay. And so they were using these unprotected categories. So you talk about
yeah.
Jews being next on the list.
Yeah.
That's how this works.
Well, I should say back on the list, because we were discriminated against in housing also. And you could just say, no, this is a community for Christians only. Yeah. And I can see that coming back. And this disaster of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of basically saying that you can discriminate based on religion, but right now at least not on race, not on against women in theory, and obviously people always find ways around it, but not as overt as this. And but I hear the argument, what if I wanted him to write, F you, Mary, or whatever, and like he says, I just don't feel comfortable writing, putting my name on a curse. If the business has certain policies about here's what we do for everybody and here's what we won't do for anybody, that's different, right? You can have a kosher butcher, you can be a kosher butcher and someone says, well, I want you to serve pork. And the kosher butcher can say, no, this is my religion and I don't work with pig, and I don't work with pig for anybody. It's not just Jew, non-Jew. This is my business and I do kosher service. The cake baker is discriminating against a certain group of people. And the debate, I think, in America is this a discriminated group of people who deserve equal rights? Or do they deserve the discrimination because they're an abomination? That's literally what is happening in this debate about LGBTQ. What other reason are people accepting of his decision?
So he decides he's going to make the cake because the powers that be come down and say you have to make the cake. But most powerful, most popular
Yeah.
farm in Chester, right? Everybody runs this farm. It's owned by a man who thinks everybody in this room is going to rot in hell. He comes right out and says, I'm a fundamentalist Christian, and you are all going to rot in hell.
Right.
But we all go into his farm and give him our money. I don't.
Is it
Around the corner.
is it a great farm?
It's a great farm.
And he'll sell to you?
He'll sell to me. He'll
I-
take my
yeah.
dollar, but I'm going to rot in hell.
So I think that's really just the distinction. Yes, I think that's the distinction of what you're getting at, and you're right. And if you want to take your business elsewhere, and by the way, I've never eaten at Chick-fil-A, and I'm never going to, right? And I think, or Hobby Lobby, which I don't think they even have Hobby Lobbies around here. I don't know. Do they have Hobby Lobby in New Jersey?
Yeah,
They do? I'm never going there, right? So you can do that, but I still think there's just a real distinction between those people are jerks, but Amazon is really kind of scummy too, but I use them like twice a week, right? Because it's just so convenient. So I don't feel good about that. But bottom line is, I think that it's about, we have to do this work because it's about protecting a group of people who are being discriminated against. You know, this Muslim ban that is now continues to be litigated is, to me, discrimination based on religion. You know, in reality, I think it's actually racism, but if they're saying it's about these group of people who are coming from a primarily Muslim country because we fear Muslim fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, that is a religious discrimination around immigration, and we were literally in the same kind of boat during World War II when the US would not accept Jewish refugees from Europe because we were Jews. So to me, that's a clear-cut example of something we can take a stand on that is both separation of church and state issue, and also we can speak very emotionally from the Jewish history of having been exactly there. And I think the Jewish community on the whole has been really great. Like our community in Toronto, Areinu, adopted a Muslim family from Syria, set them up with an apartment, like took them bowling or whatever. I mean, like have totally embraced this family that came over to Canada. And it's a beautiful thing. And I think overall the whole Jewish community has been going out of their way, or when something happens of discrimination toward the Muslim community here. And that's great. But no one's saying, and this is about the separation of church and state, and this is about our government not being neutral to religion. So I think it's a perspective.
You talk about the government like it's one entity,
Right.
or one thing. The government is made up of many politicians who are elected by different constituencies. Do you ever see the time when the Jews for Secular Democracy would endorse specific candidates
No.
because of their...
We can't endorse candidates because of the Johnson Amendment that says 501c3 nonprofit organizations cannot endorse or say that they're against a particular candidate. What we can do is say, here are the issues we care about. Here's how all these candidates stand on those issues. Decide for yourself. Now, getting rid of the Johnson Amendment was something that Trump had been talking about, and it was really the main key victory for Secular Coalition for America in 2018, along with this Free Thought Caucus, was that they got that out of the spending bill. There was a tax bill that was going to dismantle the Johnson Amendment and allow 501c3s to endorse candidates. And that's a disaster on a whole other level that I won't go into, but I'm glad. But that's an ongoing and continuing fight. So while we can't endorse particular candidates, we can certainly say, we've asked them where they stand on these issues, and here's where they stand on these issues, and let people decide for themselves. And I think we would ask some of the unique questions.
I think we have time for one more
Okay, sure.
So, are they actively involved in the child marriage laws, which I think are probably the the freedom of religion protection that I think is the biggest abomination out of all of them. Where even I believe it was going to pass and Christie vetoed it, where we were going to get rid of it in New Jersey.
Yeah.
I
pass.
thought, did they overrule his veto? Because he vetoed it.
I remember reading something about it very recently, and I don't remember what it was, but I do remember feeling totally outraged about, you know, this particularly, like, I forget what percentage of it, but like half of them are marriages between men over 40, and the exception is made for girls like under 17, and many of them coming from like the former Soviet Union and Asia and so on. And but even in this country, because of the religious exemption, families agree. You got to get family permission to let your 15-year-old daughter marry somebody, but it happens.
Happens in the Orthodox community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So if you email me and remind me, then I think that's definitely right up our alley as far as saying there shouldn't be religious. So this is like that religious freedom question, right? Because I can see the counter argument, which is my 15-year-old is deeply in love, or doesn't matter what my 15-year-old thinks, because arranged marriage is how we've always done it. This is how it was done in the Bible. This is the way it's supposed to be done. And we're going to do it the way our religion tells us is the way to be done. And we have to now balance, well, but as secular people, we believe that young people really haven't hit adulthood till at least 18. And frankly, I think 18 is kind of young, but okay, 18, right? If they can die for our country, you know, then they get the option to get married, but they can't drink for another 3 years. I can see us taking a stand on that. So that, just remind me or forward me the next article about it. And, you know, and that's another one that I think that some folks in the Jewish community might not feel so comfortable about, because there's a lot of young marriage in the Orthodox community. But 18 is young to get married now. And we can acknowledge that and just say we've moved from where we were 1,000 years ago. Thank you guys so much for participating.